There's a part of World War II history that, well, rarely gets the spotlight. Away from the front lines, far from organised supply chains, millions of rural families were left to fend for themselves when ration systems broke down. These weren't people with stockpiled warehouses or guaranteed deliveries. They were small farmers and villagers who had to rely on instinct, tradition, and whatever resources they could control. When official rations failed, survival didn't come from luck. It came from practical systems, habits built over generations and sharpened under pressure. These methods weren't written in manuals or taught in classrooms. They were passed quietly, applied daily, and refined through necessity. What's worth understanding is that these weren't desperate last resorts. They were structured, repeatable strategies that kept people fed when everything else collapsed. And the reason they still matter is simple. Those same conditions can return in different forms, and the solutions haven't lost their value. They planted fast-growing crops that produced food before shortages deepened. One of the first adjustments families made was shifting to crops that matured quickly. Root vegetables like turnips and radishes, along with leafy greens, became essential because they could be harvested in weeks rather than months. This allowed households to generate food quickly, reducing dependence on unreliable supplies. If you apply this today, focus part of your garden on fast-growing crops that can fill gaps when longer-term plants aren't ready. They relied heavily on hardy crops that could survive poor conditions. Not every season was ideal, especially during wartime disruption. Families prioritized crops that could tolerate poor soil, inconsistent care, and unpredictable weather. Potatoes, cabbage, and similar staples became reliable because they didn't require perfect conditions to produce. You can apply this by choosing crops known for resilience rather than just high yield under ideal conditions. They stretched flour and grains by combining them with other ingredients. Grain shortages were common, so families found ways to make what they had last longer. Flour was often mixed with ground potatoes or other fillers to extend its use. This allowed them to continue making bread and other staples without exhausting their supply too quickly. You can experiment with similar methods by blending ingredients to stretch limited resources. They foraged for wild foods to supplement their diet. When cultivated food wasn't enough, people turned to the land around them. Wild greens, berries, and edible plants became an important supplement. This required knowledge of what was safe to eat and when it was available. Learning basic foraging skills today can add another layer of food security, especially in rural or semi-rural areas. They kept small livestock for consistent protein sources. Large livestock required more resources than most families could spare. Instead, they focused on smaller animals like chickens or rabbits, which required less feed and space. These provided a steady supply of protein without overwhelming available resources. You can apply this by considering manageable livestock options if space and conditions allow. They preserved every surplus to prevent future shortages. Whenever there was extra food, it was preserved immediately. Drying, pickling and storing ensured that nothing went to waste. This created a buffer for times when fresh food wasn't available. You can build this habit by preserving even small surpluses instead of relying solely on fresh consumption. They reused and repurposed every scrap of food, you know. Waste wasn't an option. Leftovers were transformed into new meals, and even small scraps were used whenever possible. A simple dish might evolve over several days, each time being adjusted and extended. You can adopt this by planning meals that can be repurposed instead of discarded. They cooked in ways that maximized nutrition from minimal ingredients. Cooking methods were chosen carefully. Slow cooking, for example, allowed families to extract maximum value from bones, vegetables and grains. This ensured that even simple meals provided as much nutrition as possible. You can apply this by focusing on cooking techniques that enhance the value of your ingredients. They shared resources within their communities. Survival wasn't always individual, you know. Families often worked together, sharing tools, seeds, and sometimes even food. This reduced risk and increased overall stability within the community. While modern life is, well, a bit more individual, building connections with others can still provide support during difficult times. They adjusted their expectations and focused on consistency. Meals were simpler, and variety was honestly quite limited. But you see, consistency mattered more than comfort. By focusing on what was available and making it work, families avoided unnecessary strain on their resources. You can apply this by simplifying your approach to food and focusing on reliability. They built systems rather than relying on one-time solutions. Perhaps the most important lesson is that these weren't just one-off tricks. They were part of a larger system that combined growing, preserving, and managing food. Each method supported the others, creating a structure that could handle disruptions. You can build a similar system by combining small, practical steps into a consistent routine. These survival methods still offer real value in uncertain times. What kept peasant families fed during World War II wasn't access to abundance. It was the ability to adapt, manage resources, and apply proven methods consistently. These strategies worked under pressure, and they still work today because the principles behind them haven't changed. If you found this useful, subscribe for more deep dives into World War II survival strategies and practical knowledge that still holds value today. Share this with someone who understands that real resilience comes from knowing how to adapt when systems fail.